Well, hello, everyone, and welcome back to this week's edition of the COVID-19 Survey Working Group. It's my distinct pleasure to be back here again with another great speaker and engaging conversation around survey research methods in COVID-19 times. As always, my goal here is to present a wide array of different perspectives and different stances and viewpoints on how to conduct research. And I think the pairing that we have from last week to this week is actually going to be quite fruitful for conversation and discussion. Last week, we were able to dive into the world of some representative polling approaches and really have some interesting conversations around some of the views there. This week, we're going to look into the world of social media advertising and reaching populations through Facebook, Instagram, and other platforms. And I think we'll be able to have some interesting conversation and contrast between the two talks that we've had back to back here. Whether you're joining in the Zoom version of this or on the YouTube link, if you do have any questions, please feel free to ask them using the chat box. You can use that here on Zoom or the chat function on YouTube as well. And I'll try to weave those into conversation as we go. Our speaker for this week is Shahmir Ali, who joins us from NYU and has done quite a bit of research on COVID-19 topics, particularly using these larger N approaches in a social media context. And so I think Shahmir will be able to fill us in on some of his background in this work and what he's been up to. And then, as always, we'll try to reserve lots of time for conversation as we go. So with that, Shahmir, I'll give you the floor and we can get started here. Thanks so much for joining us this week.
Thank you very much, Eric, and nice to see you all. Hope you're all doing well. It was great to be invited to this forum and getting to hear all of your great perspectives when it comes to survey research during COVID, which is certainly quite a topic and something everyone's been grappling with. So I'm happy to share my perspectives on this. I'll give a little bit of introduction about myself. I'm a PhD student here at the NYU School of Global Public Health. A lot of my research is actually on Asian American health, and particularly looking at lifestyle behaviors and diet and exercise related factors that are involved in non-communicable disease disparities among Asian Americans and Asian immigrant populations in general. But I mean, same with everyone. The second COVID hit, everything is, you put it on the table and everybody goes into COVID for a bit. And so this is where the study emerged, which is led by my advisor, Dr. Ralph DiClemente, who unfortunately wasn't able to make it today. So I'll be presenting on behalf of our team. Yeah, so what I'll do is I'll share my screen now. Here we go. I will make it full view. Okay, so what I'll be sharing with you all today was the methodology behind a large survey that we conducted here at NYU, looking at knowledge, attitudes, practices, beliefs, and actually lots and lots of different indicators at once among American adults during the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic, specifically March and April of 2020. And I'll basically, and I can actually go to the next slide. What essentially I'll be doing is I'll give you a little bit of an overview of what our study was and what we sought to get out of the data, and also give you an overview of the current state of our research, what we've been able to find. And I mean, one of the key things with this sort of sampling that we did, which is the publishability and the impact. So I'll show you all some of the findings in our published manuscripts from this study, but then majority of our conversation, I'll try to center it around the actual mechanics of the study, basically our use of Facebook and affiliated platforms to recruit participants and conduct this research. And I'll try to share with you some of the the stories and some of the struggles that we faced, because some of these things aren't actually like reported in journal articles that use similar approaches to recruit participants. Like, this is just stuff we just discovered when we did it. And so that's actually why we made sure to report some of these things in our manuscript, which is the one that this sort of conversation will be based on, because I actually published the methodology we used as part of the study. So without further ado, The NYU COVID CAP study is sort of what we've sort of termed it informally now, was initially developed in January 2020, when things just started, getting a little bit intense here in North America with respect to COVID. I was still in New York. Then I'm actually not in New York anymore. I've moved with my family back here in Delaware. And we were like, we were looking at the situation, and my advisor, Ralph, was like, okay, like there's something happening, because Ralph had done a lot of work on Ebola. And so his work had been in like, knowledge, attitudes, practices related to Ebola as well. And so he saw some of the same things playing out in the early days when it came to like how to protect oneself against COVID, thoughts about COVID. And so we just sat together, me, Ralph, and a couple of other faculty and postdocs, and developed this study idea. And so we knew that it would be very hard to recruit people. So the thought we had was to explore social media as a means of getting data rapidly. And so there had been some evidence on its use, but none of us had actually used it before. And so since I was the kind of youngster of the group, I was substantially younger than everybody there. I was sort of tasked with sort of figuring this out, which is why I'm actually here speaking with you today, because I sort of ran the whole process. So basically the study was a Qualtrics-based survey that we disseminated via social media. And so it was implemented in March and then adapted and then re-implemented in April. So here's sort of our study team. And so it was led by my advisor, Ralph, as well as Dr. Tozan and Dr. Foreman, and a team of doctoral students, including myself here at NYU. So what did our survey include? I'll just give a quick snapshot of what we actually assessed. It started off with the very basics of knowledge, attitudes, behaviors, and risk perceptions, but we realized that a lot of people were probably studying that at the time too. So we tried to sort of spice it up by adding lots of other variables that could be, associated with certain COVID-related outcomes. And it ended up being just a broad needs assessment with respect to food insecurity, loneliness. We had mental health outcomes, lifestyle behavioral outcomes, wide array. And so it was a mixed bag. Ultimately ended up being a 20 to 30 minute survey. It was a long survey, which worried us. We were like, will people take it if it's that long? The short answer is yes, they did. And I'll show you some of that when I go into the mechanics of the process. But basically, the survey was informed by various public health behavior change theories, the health belief model, as well as past work on other infectious disease outbreaks. So just a really quick snapshot. In our conversation today, I won't actually go into much of the actual data. I'll focus it on the methodology, but this is where we've actually published our findings thus far. So we have our methodology paper, which is the first one, which will basically be in most of our conversation today. But we have 4 of our data papers that have either been accepted or published, and 2 of which are the ones I led as well. And then we have some more that are in the works. So we are still sort of churning out our findings, because we ended up getting a total sample of about 11,000, 6,000 for each round. And so we have a pretty substantial data set that has various indicators and comparisons we've been making, and to illuminate what happened in the early months of the pandemic. So yeah. So without further ado, I'm going to now go into the sort of meat of my conversation today, which is how we did this survey, and specifically looking at Facebook-based advertising. So initially, when we were conceptualizing the study, we were thinking, we wanted to make it an internet-based survey, but like, how do we disseminate it? So there are many ways of internet-based dissemination. We were choosing between Google and Facebook, basically. So there's Google-based advertising and Facebook-based advertising. At the time, I was basically tasked to test out both. I had such a hard time figuring Google out. I remember just looking up all those websites and trying to figure out like, how do we create the ad? And I tried to create a Google ad too, but it was just very confusing. So I ended up finding a lot of literature on Facebook-based advertising, and this has actually been explored extensively in public health. And there's a great systematic review by Whitaker et al. From 2017, which actually showed, which gave a sort of overview of how Facebook has been used for public health research with respect to recruitment specifically, in getting participants to take, for example, online surveys, or getting participants to get involved with an intervention, recruitment in various different capacities when it comes to public health research. And as you can see, it's been used in a wide variety of different fields and subfields of public health. And so we thought, why not? This seems great. And in particular, as I'll go into a little more depth later, Facebook-based advertising is not just Facebook. That is the beauty of this specific platform. Is it's Facebook, Instagram, Messenger, and also Facebook affiliated platforms. So you have a chance to actually reach out to a broad array of different social media platforms at once with the same advertisement or a same sort of campaign. And this is particularly helpful depending on your population, your specific population characteristics. Younger people are more likely to use Instagram than they are Facebook. And there's other considerations that allow you to really target your approach in terms of Facebook-based recruitment. But before I continue on, I will make a big caveat. So initially my plan was to actually take screenshots of the process and of how we did it, and of some of our preliminary recruitment data. But the platform changed, and I don't know when. It probably happened in a month ago or something, but the interface is new. So that's a big caveat. So what I remember, and when I did this way back in this time last year, actually, so it's probably this time last year, we were actually conducting data collection. So that's just a caveat, I will say. So with anything with internet-based platforms, constantly having updates and changes. So I'll basically, and I was able to find a lot of our retrospective data, but I'll just make that caveat that some things might have changed since our experience last time. So I'll begin by giving an overview of what it means to actually, and how we approached using the platform for recruitment, and what sort of materials you need for a Facebook or social media based advertisement campaign. Some of it is probably pretty intuitive, and it's very similar to the actual process of recruitment when it comes to any other public health study, having a recruitment flyer, making sure your important information is there. But there's also a number of considerations when it comes to these Facebook-based advertisements in terms of what you can put, what you need to have, and what you can't have in a certain advertisement. So with Facebook specifically, in order to actually have a campaign, an advertisement campaign, you often have to have a page set up. So an actual sort of like a profile for your study, in order to be used as a platform from which you will create an ad and disseminate a certain ad. So in this case, we had to actually first set up a page. We didn't realize this. So we had to set up a Facebook page, very simple. We call it NYU Survey on the Impact of the COVID-19 Outbreak. This is actually a figure from that paper, the methodology paper that we had published. Then the key thing is that the primary text you have so there's what Facebook calls primary text, which is the text that you see above the actual link, or you'll see right here in this case. Now, what you can go through with the IRB may not be the same of what Facebook will allow you to put in the actual primary text ad. So this is the big caveat and something we learned. So what I mean by that is Facebook has a lot of its own policies on what it allows to put in the primary text section of a Facebook advertisement that you have to be aware of. For example, you can not really use all caps. You cannot use all caps. And there's a couple of other red flags that it doesn't allow you to use that, for example, a regular IRB would allow you to put into the text of a recruitment flyer. So you have to navigate both the situation of the IRB, but also the situation of an internet platform and their own policies. So then it comes the sort of the main thing that one sees. Ultimately, you have a media, like you can have an image or something that could be, the face of it. You could have like a recruitment flyer. We decided to keep it simple. This was a stock image of COVID-19 when it was like, Creative Commons at the time. So and it still is, you could just use this sort of image. It was the stock footage. And we used that. And then we added the Qualtrics link. And we try to keep it simple. And that is essentially the key information. Now, there's oftentimes a lot of further specifications you can add into an advertisement. For example, there's the call to action, which allows you to specify that. And that is a specific, what do you want it to say in terms of what it means to click on the link or to click on this ad? Is it learn more or check us out? Like, it gives you a couple of options on what you can actually put as a language for the call to action. It gives you some pre-specified language in this regard. So yeah, that is a very basic overview of some of the key components when it comes to the actual advertisement that one could use. And again, this could be done in various different ways. And and since then, and actually I'll mention this in our conversation, I've actually utilized some of the lessons learned from this Facebook study into some of my own research when it comes to Asian Americans. I just completed a different study in March 2021 looking at young Asian American health. And that actually might give you an overview of how to even better enhance the use of the advertisement's different options when it comes to disseminating your ad and disseminating your study information. The next thing that's really important is when it comes to an ad is targeting the ad. And it's important to know what Facebook allows you to do and what it doesn't, and the data it has and what it doesn't. So Facebook has the most, so users of Facebook are able to report their age and their sex, I think it's gender identity. I don't know which one they actually ask. It's been a while since I created my Facebook account. But that is really the only main self-reported data that Facebook has. In trying to target an ad for your specific subpopulation, Facebook does still allow you, and I should also say it has location related data that people can also put in, and also Facebook can, so it has both user self-reported data, but then importantly, it has an algorithm that allows one to really target an ad towards certain groups of people. For example, you'll see that they have things like interests, connections, behaviors. Facebook will analyze user data in order to identify what a user likes to do, and what type of person a user might be. And it allows you to really get specific as to what subgroups of people you want to have your ad be shown to. In our case, our survey population was very broad. We were looking at residents of the United States, and all genders, and ages 18 and above. And so, but you might, focus on certain regions, or like in the case of my second study with Asian Americans, you can focus on certain. Now, the thing with race and ethnicity is that Facebook also uses its algorithms for that subpopulation, for that demographic situation as well, in that it makes a deduction as to whether or not a user is more likely to be potentially Hispanic or Asian American based on the pages they follow, based on their different activities. So it's an interesting deduction process, and a lot of it is mysterious. Like Facebook doesn't publish on how it actually, the mechanics of it. But in our case, our focus population, the second study was Asian Americans. It was generally successful. It was generally able to target Asian Americans. And we saw that from the fact that we got largely Asian American people who attempted to take our survey from the Qualtrics end. We could analyze that. So anyways, that's just sort of the big picture stuff to know what Facebook allows one to do and what it doesn't, and what is self-reported data and what is an algorithm coming in and making estimations. So, but it's really important to know all sort of these specifications, because it can really be a way to enhance your study and recruitment, and particularly cost efficiency. So this is something I alluded to earlier as well. And we often make an effort to mention in all of our papers as well, is that we didn't just recruit from Facebook. Facebook was by far the platform we recruited from the largest from. Like that was where most of our participants came from. But Facebook, because it owns so many other social media platforms, it allows one to actually target all of its major platforms at once with the same ad in just different styles in these different platforms. And so the main ones that you might be curious about is the Instagram. Instagram definitely is by far the second most, the giant after Facebook. And then also Messenger. So for those who don't know, Messenger is actually, it used to be the same part of Facebook. It was just how you'd send messages. But now it's actually a separate application it's a, Facebook Messenger and Facebook are now sort of separate entities and how, they're owned by Facebook both, but that's sort of the messaging platform. And then there's something called the Audience Network, which is a new thing that Facebook has, sort of offered to, everyone in terms of people who are interested in using their advertising platforms. But what is the Audience Network? So basically, this is a group of third-party vendors that Facebook has partnered with, or who have gone and tried to partnered with Facebook, that allow Facebook ads to be shown on these platforms. So these can be like news organization websites, basically platforms that aren't Facebook. And so audience network-based recruitment can actually enhance the reach even further beyond simply Facebook, right? Because oftentimes people have concerns about certain social media platforms being catered or being used by certain groups of people much more, which is frankly, for all of these platforms, there are inevitable respondent biases in terms of who is on these platforms and who is not. But by allowing this variety of different social media platforms and also connecting with the audience network, it allows for the potential for slightly more diversification of a potential audience of who might see your ad. So somebody might not have a Facebook account, but they might see your ad in a news website organization that's maybe partnered with Facebook. Or, it's who is in the audience network is a very wide range. But that is sort of what the audience network is. It's connected third-party sources. The next thing to consider is how your ad will be shown. And that is another great feature when it comes to Facebook specifically, because of the fact that it has lots of different ways of accessing both Facebook itself as well as its affiliated platforms. So you have the idea of Facebook news feeds, which is when you go and you scroll through an ad. You might, those of you who use social media might already be familiar with seeing like an ad, it's sponsored in front. So that is an example of a Facebook newsfeed advertisement. Same thing with Instagram, you have a newsfeed. Facebook also has its marketplace. Your ad can be shown in the marketplace section of the app. In videos, it can be like during a video your ad pops up, because Facebook, you can also view videos. There's many, many ways that Facebook can sort of be shown. So basically that is sort of the key components. But what I'm going to try to do is, because of time, I'm realizing I'm going to try to go through a little bit quickly now and just show you some of so this is an example of the family interaction study that I did for Asian Americans that occurred in 2021. This is separate from the COVID study, but I realized it can give a flavor of how you can maybe target ads for specific platforms based on this and setting up a Facebook page. And so given the time, so just a reminder, I have 20 minutes in total, or
Yeah, we've got about 5 more minutes or so here if you're able to finish up the presentation, and then we can get into some of the conversation.
Okay, that's fine. So I'm going to actually then go a little bit quickly, but I have the slides too in case anybody's curious. So the key things I wanted to mention is the algorithm. Facebook has a very complicated and mysterious algorithm, so it's important to be aware of that. And be aware of how you can utilize the algorithm to better target your ad. And it gives you a lot of specifications. It helps you out. It tells you if you're trying to do this, then you should do that. But that's sort of what keeping that in mind. And then another thing to point out, and I think I'll focus the remaining conversations on issues when it comes to the issues and challenges and the solutions. So getting your ad approved takes time. So you have to get your ad approved. being aware of that. It can be illogical sometimes. So being prepared on the length of time it might take for your ad to actually be implemented. And then finally, once you have your ad implemented, the key thing to note is utilize all the functions that Facebook gives you in order to intervene in some of the issues you might be experiencing. Because it gives you information, for example, on how many people are seeing your ad, how many people are clicking on your ad, the amount you spend. Keeping a track on that will give you a sense on the success of your ad, and maybe if you need to tweak, your target criteria, your, population characteristics. So this is an example from our actual when we were reviewing. And so, for example, we had a large female bias, which is common across all platforms, and understanding the differences in terminology as well. You have reach versus impressions. Reach is the number of unique users you might have who will see your ad. Impressions is the number of times the ad is displayed. So you might have somebody who's seen the ad multiple times. It will count that as more impressions. And then really quickly, cost. Cost can be a big asset with this approach. So we ultimately got a cost per participant of 14 cents. So very low, and much lower than mTurk and any of these other platforms. And for a full response, and keep in mind this was a 30-minute survey, it was 18 cents per participant. So very cost efficient. And I also have some slides just to show like how it compares with some of the other findings. This is from Whitaker et al.'s systematic review. And then, representativeness has been the other sticking point, right? About why, so that's why our methodology study really focused on comparing our findings with the US Census in this case, just to show people, okay, you're concerned about, what percent female, what percent male. So we literally went and took our demographic characteristics and compared it with the US adult population. And yes, there are ultimately 100% key biases that need to be acknowledged. Larger percent female, certain regional biases, educational biases. Race was one of the biggest biases we had. We had a very low sample of racial and ethnic minorities, which was unfortunate. And this, you see, is a structural issue across this platform, is that recruitment for racial and ethnic minorities using Facebook is lower. And it's unfortunate. And that's why we couldn't often do a lot of, really in-depth stratified analyses of different racial and ethnic disparities. And that's been a big part of our limitation section. So really quickly, I'm going to end by pinging off 3 challenges and solutions in terms of using the platform. The first, I will quickly mention is, and this is, so I'm trying to focus on sort of things that you might not read, this is from the inner workings of what you discover when you use it. Comments and reactions are a big issue and something you have to be really careful about. Facebook comment sections, as many of you all might know, are a horrible place. So they can be very vicious and vile and just hard to control. So we had to be very cognizant of that, especially when we were talking about COVID and people have a lot of opinions. Our approach to manage the comment section and not to create debates and create a uncontrolled comment section is we hid comments. People could make comments if they wanted to, but we hid them so others couldn't see it, so that it wouldn't also bias how the sampling was working. And so reactions, you cannot unfortunately control the comment section. You have to have that on, and the likes and the reactions. I don't know if they've changed that, but at the time that was the situation. Then really quickly, the second thing is the algorithm going wild. So this is something that you will very likely experience too, is that the algorithm is self-learning. It learns who is watching your ad, who is clicking on your ad, and it wants to help you. It's a business platform, so it wants to get you more responses. But as researchers, we don't like, our desire for, especially in convenience sampling, when we're dealing with this, is we just hope we get as much diversity as we can, but we don't actively want to skew towards some certain subgroup who might be more likely to answer. Facebook doesn't care about that. If it sees that women are answering more than men, it will show it to more women and show it to less men. So then it creates a vicious cycle of less and less men because it's showing it to more women. So you then have to intervene, which is what we had to do. And we had to create a supplemental ad only for men, only being shown to men, and pause the other ad. And so you have to then constantly monitor your data in order to sort of fight the algorithm a little bit. It's just tricky. And that's why you have to really, really pay attention to the data as it's coming in. Finally, this is one thing that we also didn't realize that would be such an issue, is there are obstacles that Facebook send. Sometimes Facebook will have its quirks or it'll have its situations. Our ad was disabled a couple of times too, just randomly, without warning. And we're like, oh no, we can't get any recruitment. We're in the middle of recruitment period. So we had to go and file a petition, like what's happening. You file a request to be like, to get it reviewed again. And once they reviewed it again, they opened up the ad and it was all fine. But that ate up like 3-4 days of recruitment for us, which we didn't realize would be an issue. And then, for example, Facebook acknowledges this, that it has people actually who reviewed the process. There's a human touch to this too. So sometimes it's at their end that, they have delays, especially during COVID, right? With health crises, they have their own delays. So that then trickles down, that could impact your recruitment. So being aware of that and, trying your best to plan ahead and, having more recruitment days than you need will be helpful. So key takeaways basically is that, sorry, I had to sort of rush through a couple slides, but I have this information if any of you all need it. But right, being aware of the different options, utilizing as much as you can. And because we were able to utilize it and really try to figure out and monitor it, we kept our costs low. It can really help your cost efficiency. And Facebook has materials. It actually has like websites to show you, gives you suggestions on utilizing its algorithm. Planning, monitoring, being prepared, having protocols, knowing, what you might expect and what you might not expect will really help to ensure the success of using the platform to get a large sample. Won't be representative, but it can be large for you to do potentially lots of analyses. And you can also utilize and intervene when you can to enhance sampling, do some little aspects of purposeful sampling. For example, in our case, we did with men. We were able to increase our sampling of men by doing the second targeting of male-only ads. So that is the sort of the key stuff I thought I'd bring up today. Do let me know if you have any questions. And yeah, that's basically it. Thank you.
Shahmir, thanks so much. That's a really interesting presentation and super helpful to be able to benefit from some of your lessons learned. I know that every time I do a different project, there are these little things from ad approval through to not realizing how the algorithm is going to kick in. And so having the benefit of your experience there is very helpful. I think in the conversation here, there are sort of two different big issues to talk about. One are some of the issues that are unique to your experience working with the Facebook platform. So for instance, that algorithm and how that played out in your recruitment. The other one are some of these broader questions about who you're talking to and representativeness of doing social media sampling in the first place. And so I'm curious to try and talk about both of these in the little bit of time that we have remaining. And we may have some questions come up about these topics as well. Okay, so to talk about the algorithm piece just for a minute, because I think that's really interesting. I'm wondering if you can tell me a little bit more about how much you see of how Facebook is targeting these things versus what's happening in the background. Are there aspects and ways that these are being targeted that you don't necessarily know about as a researcher?
Absolutely. That was something that we were grappling with too. I mean, Facebook does give you these really detailed targeting options, but in reality, because of the fact that so much of this data is not user reported, ultimately we just see that Facebook says that it uses, and it tells us, it has in its website, it says that we use user behavior to make deductions on certain subpopulations and groups. But there was another great there was a paper that emerged in our literature review that showed that Facebook actually might be discriminating against certain subpopulations and how it sends ads out. So, right, there's so much of the algorithm that is completely mysterious and kept under lock and key, I'm assuming, that it doesn't tell us. And I mean, ultimately, we are working off of this sort of because of that we for example saw such a low response rate for racial and ethnic minorities. We were very cognizant of that, and we knew that this was, and in fact, we were emphasized at every paper we wrote, this is not random sample. This is not, it's, I mean, and I'm sure it randomly sends it to certain people, like in terms of like a certain subpopulation you targeted for men, they'll send it to certain men based on how much money you put in, but it's like not randomized and it's not actively representative in any way. You can intervene to enhance the sampling of certain subgroups, but ultimately, right, it's a lot of it is a mystery.
This was actually an experience that I had as well in some of our sampling where we were using commercial platforms. So in this case, we were going through Canada Post and doing what was a randomized sample to try to get a representative cohort, but trying to use a tool that is geared towards targeted advertising and convince them to use it in exactly the opposite way, which is that we want a completely non-targeted approach here. We do not want to be influenced by things like gender or income or household status or things like that. It can be an interesting challenge to try to commandeer some of these commercial tools to kind of do the opposite of what they're designed for, right? They're designed to get clicks from the people who are going to click, and we want to hear from the people who won't click in this particular case.
Yeah.
I'm curious, so you mentioned Facebook and Instagram here. Did you see any significant differences between respondents coming from those two platforms in terms of either demographics or their responses and answers to questions?
Right. This is something that I recall also analyzing at the time. So this is another part of its algorithm, is that you can select which platforms you want it to be sent to, but it will also make it, you can also have it set such that it will choose, it will send it to where it thinks people are more likely to respond in general. And what we found is when we put that function of sort of letting it choose where it'll be seen more, because that is a way to enhance cost efficiency, it sent it to like 99.8 or 99.9% to Facebook. Was big, like leaning towards Facebook, and the very tiny amount for Instagram, it was basically unanalyzable because of the sample size disparity. But and I mean, we had a similar situation with this other Asian American study I did last month, which is that I allowed it to do both, and even with that knowledge, and that was focused on young adults, so between the ages of 18 and 35, it largely sent it to Facebook, and so I think it has to, and I was reading up on this a little bit too, is that Facebook inherently is slightly more cost effective than Instagram ads. And the reasoning why is a big curiosity of mine too. I suspect it might have to do with the demographics of who uses Facebook versus Instagram. For example, and this is a big misconception, particularly among older generations, is that they assume that Facebook is used by younger people. Like social media, like the demographic distribution of Facebook users is younger than the average American. That our sample was older than the average American. And this is something with Facebook, is that it's actually younger people don't use it. Like I'm actually in Gen Z myself, I'm 22, so I know that Instagram is where everybody's at. So youths don't use Facebook as much anymore. So our sample were largely people in their 40s and in their 50s. Who are older. But then there's a thing, the really older population of like people in their 80s and 90s, they certainly were underrepresented in our sample when we did the comparison. But in general, when comparing Facebook with Instagram, you will find that people on Instagram are younger. That is the age distribution. But further than that, I think I'm also quite curious myself based on both of these findings, but yeah.
Okay, there's an elephant in the room that we're going to have to talk about in a minute here, which are these broader questions of social media representativeness. But just before we go there, I do want to ask just two specific questions about the advertisements you used. So one problem that we had in Canada where we were going to do an experiment comparing social media marketing to the representative sample was that the Canadian government rolled out regulations about who could advertise related to COVID-19. And so we were actually kiboshed in terms of running this experiment because we weren't a government agency. Did you run into any barriers around things that were, for instance, designed to protect against COVID-19 misinformation affecting how your survey was advertised or run?
Absolutely. I recall this. This was in March 2020. I recall that even then, Facebook was taking some steps to protect against this because anybody and everybody can use advertising, So for Facebook-based, you have to get, so there's a lot of approval processes, but the review time just takes a little longer, usually, if it's about a COVID-19 related, sort of thing. And I recall that they made a notice of that. And they often have, they explicitly say, and there will be times that, it depends on the nature of your ad. Your ad might not get approved, especially, if, so it does, there's a human element of the approval process, but in terms of that layer of difficulty and like sort of approval on Facebook was at the Facebook level. Because we would also already seen, and many of you all probably are seeing as well, that COVID research is happening on Facebook. There are many surveys being disseminated on Facebook, at least in the United States. But they do check extra. It takes a little longer. Yeah.
The final question I have to ask about the ad is just a curiosity. We also had a survey that was quite long, and people stayed with it a surprising amount. We had very low attrition rates despite having a 25-minute survey. I noticed that your ad advertised it as being shorter than that. It referenced a 10 to 15-minute window. So I'm curious if you can just tell us about that decision of how long it was versus how long you advertised, and anything you learned during the survey about attrition rates and respondent drop-off because of the volume of questions you were asking.
Right. So that initial rate was actually when we the 10 to 15 minutes is what it took us to do it. And we sent it to in our pre-testing among our family members and everyone. But when we did the initial pre-testing, just to get a sense, was 10 to 15 minutes. But I think that what we ended up seeing then is that sort of 20-30 minute figure was what some people were taking that long. I think particularly older people were willing to sit through for 20-30 minutes, 40 minutes at times, go through each question in more depth than we had calculated in our preliminary assessment of how long it takes. And I think that this is a point of mention we make with our cost efficiency as well, is that it was very, very cost efficient, partly because we did a survey on COVID during COVID when it was happening at a very important time. But people just wanted to share their thoughts. Like they're scared, like what's happening. They want to know. And so this was often a platform that you can, because we had a whole attitude section and stuff. So I think that harnessing the power of emerging, doing research when it is of heightened public interest is, especially in the context of online survey research, is a big, big asset. Yeah.
Absolutely. And we've now seen all the discussions around survey fatigue on COVID too, and how that's played out. Okay, look, I now have to ask a few tough questions about representativeness here and the broader question of social media-based surveying, especially given the conversation we had last week in which we were talking about some of the importance of doing fully representative projects. And I think, Bryn, if you're okay, I know you have a couple of questions to ask here, so maybe I can allow you to ask a couple of these first, and then I'll jump in as well.
Yes, thank you very much, Eric, and thank you, Shahmir Ali, for a really, really interesting talk. I have a couple of questions, one of which I think you've answered already, but I'll make it a little bit more technical, and that is that you've got this sample from a Facebook advertisement. So we have to worry about that advertisement as a stimulus for people responding. Advertisements are advertisements are advertisements. So anyway, so we've got a sample, and then we say, it's a natural question, to what extent can our sample be deemed as being in some way representative of the population? And so you're into the whole weighting problem then. So that's one question. It's really technical. But then I have another one, which is much more epistemological. And that is that when we carry out surveys, we, relatively speaking, have control. In this sense, I have a feeling that the researcher is giving up control to a private corporation, which has a lot of ethical problems associated with it, which we all know about. And so that is as I say, it's a more general question, but I think it's an important one.
Yes. Thank you very much. No, so for the first comment about representativeness, yeah, I think that's something we've been big in every paper we're saying, this is not a representative sample, because we know for a fact, there's so many things that were out of our control. And that actually ties to your second question exactly, which is that who were the people who saw the ad and didn't click it? We will have actually the Facebook, I'll tell you what data that Facebook does give us on this. It'll tell us the gender and age distribution of the impressions. And even that is self-reported. So there's so many layers of bias that could emerge, like how one reports one's age. I know it's very typical, like for example, young people who want to get their Facebook will just put an older age and just join Facebook. Like you can have those layers of bias. And then you can have bias in, like, as you're saying, absolutely, like some people will get enticed by that ad and some people won't. Who are the people getting enticed and who aren't? Some people and that's another thing we found, is that in our comment sections, of course, because we didn't get IRB to analyze the comment section, so we couldn't report on that. But you have to consider, for example, we're from New York University. New York has its own, a blue state, these intellectuals in New York, like these liberals. So, and we're going to all the United States. We're getting sample. We got sample from all 50 states plus Puerto Rico. So we were actually lucky we got that.
Yeah.
But of course, we knew there was so many layers of bias there, and absolutely. So that's
I would say that the regional differences in terms of what you showed on your slides, the regional differences were really quite stark. And I don't know, the regional breakdown in the United States of internet usage, but I would imagine it is also quite strongly differentiated by region.
Yes, no doubt. And I think that even within one region, you might have different usages of certain social media platforms, different internet access, for example. But I think some of that regional differences was simply by the fact that we were New York University, and some people might just not have good perceptions of New York and don't want to take a study from New York University versus, right? So,
right.
Absolutely. And I think to your second point, I think that is something that is an issue, right? It's a balance of how much control can you, and there's a pro and con where you can get enormous study samples within the space of 2 weeks. We got 6,000 people, and so you get participants who you are going through a third party for the recruitment, but the ultimate survey data collection is still on your own Qualtrics survey. It's not Facebook that has access to the data, your actual data. It's used for that recruitment, but still, you have less control over that. And you can intervene on certain things, but you still, don't know. And I absolutely agree. There's many ethical implications. And I think that's where, especially when there's so much of the algorithm of how they're recruiting it goes, it will inevitably be impossible to ever term this as anywhere close to a representative sample. It will always be a form of a convenience sample.
Yeah, I understand. Thank you. Yeah.
Great questions there. And I mean, this, if there was a big issue or question I could bring up as we wrap up here, it's this question of what representative means in some senses, because we often talk about this in fairly straightforward demographic veins. And you had that nice chart there of how it lined up, and presumably that ripples forward into which you can weight and which you don't have sufficient data to weight on and the like. But there are also these questions of the representativeness in terms of harder to measure kinds of attributes. Are they ideologically representative? Are they politically representative? Are they representative in terms of education, in terms of even some of the dependent variables that we're exploring, like COVID risk perception? So one of the things we found in an experimental design was that when we used a COVID recruitment instrument, we got higher response rates, but you got people who were more concerned about COVID than when you had a survey that was nominally about something else, but asked the same questions about COVID. So I'm curious if you can just speak a little bit to perhaps your thoughts on that, on what representativeness constitutes in this world of COVID and survey research, and perhaps any things that you want to explore going forward in future studies.
Yeah, no, I think it's such a great point about the fact of, asking ourselves, are we really measuring representativeness with the right metrics? And I mean, traditionally we look at things like gender, sex, race, but we probably should be measuring more, because ultimately these key factors have a relation, because many of these relationships have an interaction involved with them. And there might be some underlying constructs that we aren't able to pick up appropriately. If, there might be, for example, people who we recruit from Facebook might have a more likely, the connection between attitudes and behaviors might be more distinct in that sample than maybe another sample. So, and we might be adjusting for the same variables, but you might find that. So I think that's the interesting thing with COVID research, is because everybody is doing the same research at the same time so much, these systematic reviews is where I think I'm going to be paying attention to see what is sort of aligning up, and that could help to get a sense of a little better sense of, what are these salient ideas and connections and, epidemiological findings that we really need to be paying attention to, and what is a function of the fact that a certain approach, whether it be through MTurk or through Facebook or through newspapers or and certain, maybe even attempts at these representative sampling, it's just limitations with those approach. But I think there will always be a variable that somebody doesn't measure, or we will not know the realities, the true state and distribution of a certain variable for us to compare and be confident to call it representative. I think any sort of representative sample will have to be taken with a grain of salt, I think, as is always done, because there's realities that with representativeness, the best is to measure everyone, every single person. And even that has biases in terms of respondent biases. So the bias will come in from anywhere, which is why I think this having multiple studies done at the same time on such a hot topic will be interesting to see how these findings play out.
Yeah, I'll admit that perhaps this is my fatigue in the crisis showing, but I'm really excited to get past the immediate emergency here and be able to do some of this retrospective work, looking back to get into the details and the minutia of how different survey techniques lined up in terms of the quality of their estimate. And as you say, this is going to be really complicated because there may be a handful of issues where we do have quote unquote objective measures against which we can compare how different methods have performed. So vaccine uptake is one where I think we will be able to do a little bit of analysis of how close or far off different kinds of approaches were. But in many ways, COVID is not like a typical election where we do get the results at some point. Things like COVID risk perceptions and fear and behavioral change in some ways will remain a little bit ephemeral to us as we go back and do these reviews. But I'm just really keen to get into that chapter and perhaps be through with this. Okay. On that note, I just want to thank you so much for taking the time today. I don't know if you have any closing thoughts that you want to share before we wrap up here.
No, this has been great. Thank you for the opportunity. It was great to connect, and thank you for your question as well, Brian. And yeah, do feel free to reach out if you have any questions. My email was in the last slide of the presentation, but great conversation.
Thanks so much for being here. We do not have a meeting next week, but in 2 weeks' time, we'll have Dr. Kyle Payton from Yale, who will be talking about some of his work on the generalizability of COVID-19 survey research. And then as we get into May, on May 6th, we'll be visited by a speaker from the University of Milan to talk about rolling cross-sectional designs in COVID-19 research. And so I think both of these sessions will be quite interesting coming up. So enjoy the week off next week, and then we'll see the members of the group again on the 27th. Shahmir, thank you so much for being so generous with your time and sharing your results. I look forward to reading the upcoming papers.
Thank you, Shahmir. Thank you, Eric.
Goodbye. Thank you. Okay.
And I've got us off of the live stream.